Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates 60th Anniversary Interview Series, where history comes alive and challenges everything we thought we knew. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we have a truly electrifying conversation for you. We all know the story of the American Revolution, patriots fighting for freedom against the might of the British Crown. But what if I told you that one of the most pivotal moments in that fight didn't happen in Boston or Philadelphia, but in Virginia? And what if the spark that helped push the colonies toward independence wasn't a tea party or a midnight ride, but an act of emancipation? Our guest today, New York Times bestselling author and journalist, Smithsonian Associate Andrew Lawler, is here to tell us about his new book, A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis that Spurred the American Revolution. Andrew Lawler will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, so please check out our website for links and details. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Lawler's new book is A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis that Spurred the American Revolution. In his new book, he uncovers the untold story of Lord Dunmore, Virginia's last royal governor, a man who, in desperation, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who joined the British fight. The result? Chaos, fury, and the kind of political firestorm that changed the course of history. Thomas Jefferson himself admitted it. Dunmore's actions sent the patriots into a perfect frenzy, leading directly to the burning of Norfolk and Virginia's push for independence. But what about the people who answered Dunmore's call? The men who risk everything to fight for a different kind of freedom. What happened to them? And how does this forgotten chapter of history still shape the America we live in today? Andrew Lawler has spent years unraveling this remarkable story, and today he's here to share it with us. Get ready for an eye-opening conversation about revolution, race, and the myths we've built around our nation's founding. This is history like you've never heard it before, right here on the Smithsonian Associates 60th Anniversary Interview Series. Smithsonian Associate Andrew Lawler, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here again.
I always enjoy our conversations. This one is going to be really fantastic. Congratulations on the work, A Perfect Frenzy. You've shared a copy of the book with me. I very much appreciate it. It is wonderful. Congratulations again.
Thank you, Paul.
We're going to talk a little bit about the book. We're going to talk about your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. Why don't we start? Tell us briefly what you'll tell us at Smithsonian Associates and how you'll use some of these great images, because the book has some wonderful images in it too.
Yeah, I was really lucky, and they came out very nicely. And
yeah, beautiful.
I'm originally from Norfolk, Virginia, which is a seaport town in southeastern Virginia, and left town, went to college, never really went back except to see family. And then during the pandemic, I went to visit my mother, take her to Williamsburg, get her out of the house, get her out of the apartment after sitting there and during COVID. And when I was there, I ran across a mention of something called the Ethiopian Regiment, which I knew nothing about. And then simultaneously, a magazine editor called me and wanted something for Black History Month. And I said, well, I might have something. So I started to delve into this mysterious part of the American Revolution that I thought I knew everything about. It turns out I knew very little about. So that's what this book is. It's my exploration into the beginning of the American Revolution in colonial Virginia.
And it is fascinating. I just can't recommend it enough for our audience, because in it, you really challenge the traditional narrative of what the American Revolution was all about. You highlight Lord Dunmore, and in particular, some of the actions that took place right here in Virginia. As a son of Virginia, my family and I live in Virginia. We've always come to think about the American Revolution in a specific way, and that's not so much the case. Why was this overlooked, do you think, in some of the reporting and some of the history books and some of where we are today?
Well, and it's a particularly good moment to consider that origin, given that the 250th anniversary of the beginning will be with us in April, so very, very soon. we all know the story of Lexington and Concord, the brave farmers who stood up against the redcoats. I mean, these are familiar tales that the myth of the American Revolution that we're used to, that is imprinted on us. I think that the beginning of the conflict in Virginia has largely been ignored, even by Virginians, because it's a little more fraught and a little more complicated. And it does challenge the way we think about the patriots and the founders, when I think it's a lot simpler to look to New England and see pretty clearly what their issues were with the British. And to see that the British were there in the thousands, were clearly an occupying force. This was not the case in Virginia. So I think it's been very difficult for historians and also for people who are interested in history to really get a hold of why these wealthy conservative planters would want to part from Great Britain. It was always a mystery to me as a child, and it's only in my digging around that I discovered why they wanted to be independent.
I certainly did not know much of this, but you talk about something known as Dunmore's Proclamation, which, again, new to me, but fascinating, a document that offered freedom to enslaved people. The condition was that they fight for the British. So unusual, absolutely. It caused shockwaves throughout the colonies. How did the enslaved react to it? Because you would think, offering some freedom, they might be just absolutely ready to fight and join the British. But there were some differing, kind of approaches to this.
Yes. And so to give your listeners some background, Lord Dunmore, also known as John Murray, was the last royal governor of Virginia, chosen by King George III to oversee what was the largest, wealthiest, and most populous colony of the 13 colonies. And things were fine. In fact, he was good friends with a guy you've heard of named George Washington. He was part of the elite. He had enslaved people. He had plantations. And he intended to stay, brought his family over from Britain. So it was when the revolution began in 1775 that he was faced with a really difficult situation. As I mentioned, the troops are in Boston. The ships are in Boston. Virginia had very, very few, just a few dozen redcoats and maybe one or two small ships. So Dunmore is faced with a rebellion, and yet he doesn't have the troops or ships to combat it. So he has to think creatively. And one interesting fact about this man is that he was part of the 1745 Jacobite rebellion against King George II. If any of you had seen Outlander, you'll know what I'm talking about. He was part of Bonnie Prince Charlie's court. So Dunmore actually understood rebellion, I think, in a really unique way compared to other governors. Faced with this problem, what did he do? Well, he looked around. He thought, well, 4 out of 10 Virginians are enslaved by people often who were very strong patriots. So he threatened this in April 1775, didn't actually go through with it, but in November of 1775, as you mentioned, he publicly announced that he would free any enslaved person who was owned by a patriot who would fight for the king. And this changed everything because suddenly you had nearly half the population as a potential pool of recruits he could draw on. Enslaved people, though, this was not a matter of saying, oh, great, I think I'll go to Norfolk, the Norfolk area where Dunmore was based then, and become a soldier. They had to get away from their forced labor camps, their plantations, or the towns where they were owned by people. They had to cross enemy territory. And if they were caught, they certainly would have faced imprisonment, possibly torture, and maybe even death. So simply to leave was an act of incredible bravery. And of course, if you left relatives behind, your owners could do something terrible to them. And the owners were clear, we will take revenge on your family if you leave. So there were a lot of reasons why enslaved people would not immediately flock to Dunmore, but nevertheless, they did. By the hundreds, they came from as far away, as far as we know, as Massachusetts in order to seek refuge behind British lines. So it really was, I would call it the most radical document ever published in America prior to the Declaration.
Race and slavery were among the enormous contradictions that really surround this entire event, this series with Lord Dunmore. We've all come to believe that the revolution is this struggle and this fight for liberty, yet that wasn't exactly the case, especially when it came to race relations and slavery. How do you think those contradictions shape our entire national identity?
I think that the first thing to say is that both sides were fighting for liberty. Both the patriots and those who were enslaved wanted the same thing. That is freedom, the ability to make the choices in their lives they wanted to make. The patriots, however, in Virginia, and I'm not speaking about the patriots in other parts of the country, but in Virginia, the patriots certainly did not want to include Black people and enslaved people in that list of people who needed more freedom. In fact, it was clear that they did not want to emancipate the enslaved. This was not part of their vision. Their vision was to separate from Britain, but they were looking at it from a perspective of white male Virginians, mostly with property. So this is just the reality of the times, that there was an ideal of people being equal, but in practice, the white Virginians, the white Virginia gentry who controlled the patriot movement in Virginia, were dead set on not allowing emancipation because that would destroy their social and economic system. I think we need to understand the forces at work, why people made the decisions they made. And I try to outline that in the book by focusing on individuals and the stories that they tell so that we can feel some empathy for people caught in very difficult circumstances.
What other interesting contradiction that I found is this idea, the myth perhaps, surrounding the destruction of Norfolk. And we certainly have been led to believe that that was Lord Dunmore's doing. He was responsible, yet the Patriots really were responsible. How does that change our understanding of the revolutionaries?
This is so important. When I was a child, my grandparents would take me down to St. Paul's Churchyard in downtown Norfolk, the last surviving colonial structure in the city, and point to a cannonball that was stuck in the wall with a plaque underneath that said, fired by Lord Dunmore, January 1st, 1776, the date when British ships fired on what was Virginia's largest city in the largest colony. In the subsequent fire, the city was completely destroyed. The story I grew up with was that Lord Dunmore was quite the villain and a wicked man who destroyed a city that was completely defenseless. But when I started to dig, I uncovered the startling fact, which is not difficult to find, that in fact, the Patriots themselves acknowledged that they used Dunmore's brief bombardment as a reason to burn their own city to the ground and then blame it on the British. Now, why did they do this? And it took me a while to sort it out. The reason is this. Certainly, you're aware that in this country, one of the splits that we have is between people who live in rural areas and people who live in cities. Jefferson and Hamilton fought over this in Washington's administration, and we still have that split. So what was happening in Virginia was a microcosm of that. The people who lived in the country and the rural gentry saw this city as competition. They saw it as a place where you had Scottish merchants and Black people who were often literate and very skilled at what they were doing. So Norfolk was seen as a nest of Tories that had to be destroyed. So they used Dunmore's brief bombardment of the city, which was done to get rid of some snipers, in order to completely lay the city to waste. And then, more importantly, they used it as propaganda to convince wavering Virginians and wavering Americans that if the British are burning our cities, certainly the only solution is for us to separate from Britain and to fight it out. And this is what led to the Declaration of Independence, a major factor in getting people behind the patriot cause.
As you are talking, and I'm remembering a couple of your comments, you were being a good son, took your mom out post-COVID, came across this information about the Ethiopian Regiment. Tell us a little bit more about the Ethiopian Regiment and what happened to them, because they fought against their owners. Interesting name, Ethiopian restaurant after Ethiopia, of course, but a very interesting group and this military force. I'd love to know a little bit more about their experiences and what became of them.
This regiment is unprecedented in historical annals because Lord Dunmore named it Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Ethiopians at that time were considered to be erudite, they were Christians, they were seen as essentially Europeans. So this was a term of respect, one of the rare terms of respect that were used for Africans of that day. So Ethiopia didn't mean they were Ethiopians, because obviously most of these people were from West Africa, but it was a title of respect. So when Dunmore made his proclamation in November of 1775, already he had enslaved people that had flocked to his side. He put them in uniforms, he gave them arms, he trained them, formed them into a formal military unit, and then within weeks they were fighting white patriots. The first time that Black men who were organized as an army fought white people. They had a very important impact on the struggle in Virginia. Now, because of disease and because of a lack of weapons, the Ethiopian regiment found it hard to make much headway against the patriots. And in the end, they were forced to leave with Lord Dunmore to New York. Now, people like Thomas Jefferson made up lies. They said that the British, they sold them all to the West Indies. This was not true. As far as we know, all of the members of the Ethiopian regiment and their families, by the way, were taken to New York, where they were absorbed into the British Army. Here you had the first Black unit in the British Army, the British Empire, and then they were absorbed into the larger British Army in New York, where they became not soldiers per se, but they were workers, basically, skilled workers, the Black pioneers. And then the story is, it goes on because when the British lost the war, the British were still in New York. That was the last place where they had their forces. So when they evacuated thousands of Black people who had been emancipated and sent them to Canada. And from there, many of them went on to help found the colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa, including a man named Harry Washington, who, of course, had escaped from Mount Vernon. The story of these Black loyalists is fascinating and has been gone largely untold in the history books.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Our guest today is Smithsonian Associate Andrew Lawler, who has written the excellent new book, A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, the Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. We'll have links so their audience can find out more information about Andrew Lawler, his new book, A Perfect Frenzy. Congratulations again, Andrew Lawler, for this fantastic book and for all the great images inside it. I was blown away by all this. I want to recommend it to our audience. I'm not the only one that loves it. I found one of our longtime guests, Larry Sabato, author of A More Perfect Constitution, says of your book, Andrew Lawler has uncovered critical new information about why and how Virginia and its leading citizens, among them Washington and Jefferson, joined the rebellion against the British crown. And it doesn't shine a favorable light on them. Without Virginia, there might not have been a successful revolution. Lawler's fascinating new book is a revelation. That's from Larry Sabato. I want to talk to you for a second about the famous patriot Patrick Henry. He, of course, had important moments throughout the revolution. He also has some views about white citizenship and gun ownership that come out of the book and that were as a result of some of the time during the revolution. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Patrick Henry's work, and in particular, how some of this even has shaped the Second Amendment. It goes so far as to even have had some influence or laid the groundwork for the American Second Amendment, and how we have this battle in our country over the subject of both race and firearms.
Well, Patrick Henry is one of the most fascinating characters in Virginia at the time.
Yeah.
Unlike his fellow planters like Washington or Jefferson, he was a lawyer who rode the circuit. So he was going from town to town, county to county, and he understood how the smaller white farmers who could vote, they owned land, they could vote, what they thought. And he realized in April of 1775 that the conservative gentry, which was pretty pro opposing England, the smaller white farmers weren't coming along. They weren't interested. They had other things in mind that were more important to them than obscure fights over tariffs. He even said to a friend, he said, you can talk to the common people about tariffs and taxes, but these notions are too abstract for them. But if you tell them they're coming to take their guns, then they will flock to the cause. And Dunmore unwittingly helped Patrick Henry by one night seizing the powder, the gunpowder that was in the arsenal at Williamsburg, the capital of colonial Virginia. And in doing that, he outraged many, not just patriots, but Virginians in general, who felt like this was an aggressive move. Now, Dunmore managed to get out of the trouble by saying he was doing it to protect it from a slave rebellion, protect the powder from being taken by enslaved people. an excuse that was actually balked by the patriots, amazingly. But this began Patrick Henry's thinking around guns. Now, we have to understand that in colonial Virginia, a white person's gun was all important, not because of Indians, not because they needed to hunt to live, but because so many people owned enslaved people. Most white Virginians had maybe one or two slaves, not 100 or 200. So having your gun was critical. Patrick Henry understood that the threat that the British posed in taking away guns, which was completely made up, there was never an effort by the British to take the guns out of the hands of individual Virginians, that this was something that would turn the mood and turn the public toward approving of the patriot cause. And of course, this was all about guns, and it was also very deeply related to slavery at the time. So it's very hard, I think, to disentangle those from the time. And the Second Amendment indeed some of the words used in the Second Amendment did come out of this period when Patrick Henry was pushing this view in order to excite white Virginians about joining the patriot cause.
You grew up in Virginia, yet this story was new to you. I certainly did not know it. Fascinating. Andrew Lawler is our guest, Smithsonian Associate, author of A Perfect Frenzy. What surprised you in the research? What did you come across that personally challenged you throughout all of this process in terms of your reporting and what you came across?
What disturbed me the most was to discover that although I grew up in a history-minded family, we were always going to Williamsburg or Yorktown or Jamestown. We talked at home about history. Jefferson was not Jefferson. Jefferson was Mr. Jefferson. So really a presence. And we read about it and talked about it and visited sites. So I was stunned and frankly, a little angry when I discovered that many of the things I had been told either were not true or had been neglected in my education. And that got under my skin. I mean, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and the idea that I wasn't told the truth just irritates me. So I decided, well, I have to find out for myself what actually happened. And who was this guy who was my childhood villain, Lord Dunmore? I think the biggest surprise was to discover that Lord Dunmore actually is a really interesting and compelling figure. He's somebody who evolves in his views about race, for example, and religion and other areas. So I think he's somebody who's been largely ignored and just treated as a cardboard cutout villain. I think it's time now. We're 250 years old. I think we're old enough now to take a look at the facts and to maybe draw some different conclusions.
I was completely taken aback by the fact that he really was very fundamentally responsible for some of the very early language around emancipation. And I thought that was just an amazing connection. Talking about emancipation and particularly Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that was about a century following this, what are some of the connections there between Dunsmore and Lincoln and that work? Was Lincoln privy and aware of some of this too?
This is something I certainly didn't expect to get into.
Yeah.
My editor said, well, when are you going to end this book? Because traditionally you ended when Dunmore leaves Virginia. That's he leaves the stage. But when I kept digging, I discovered that, in fact, you could draw a straight line between the Emancipation Proclamation of 1775 and Abraham Lincoln's more famous decree of 1863. And how do you do that? Well, it's pretty simple. Lincoln, in order to write the Emancipation Proclamation, he had to have legal precedent. Some of his advisors knew about Dunmore's proclamation, as well as a couple of others that were made during the Revolution by British generals. And, U.S. law is based on British law. And so this example, and starting with Dunmore, whose proclamation was the most radical, this formed the basis of Lincoln's argument of why he was doing something legal. Now, Lincoln was very careful. He did not bring up Lord Dunmore's name. Why? Well, that's obvious, because even as late as the 1860s, and even as late as my childhood, to bring up Lord Dunmore was to elicit a boo and a hiss from people because he was considered a villain. And he was somebody who had almost upset the social realities in the South. So Lincoln was very much on the down low around talking about Dunmore. But if you look at the proclamation and you look at the people who are advising him, who are talking about it, it's very clear that without Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation, it's hard to imagine Lincoln doing what he did.
Andrew Lawler, it is always so nice to see you, and thank you so much for your generous time. Tell us what we should take away from this, especially as we're approaching our 250th anniversary. Put your journalist, historian hat on for just a second, and tell us how we might even rethink a revolutionary past.
I think it's time to do this. I mean, we have, whether it's guns or race or immigration or the split between cities and rural areas, I really believe that we can't address these hot button issues without going back to their origin, without going back to the source. How did we get where we are? And I didn't intend to write that book. I was just trying to correct what I saw as historical mistakes and neglect. But what I found was that this period in American history, particularly in Virginia, was a place where many of these issues first reared their head in a very clear way. And that many of the troubles that we're wrestling with today can be traced back to that time. So my hope is that this book will allow people to not just to rethink the revolution or to consider Dunmore less of a villain, but rather to rethink where we are today and how we got here. Because it's only by doing that that we can actually have some vision about where we want to go.
Smithsonian Associate Andrew Lawler has been our guest. He's been here before, a real fan favorite. Will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about Andrew Lawler, his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, and his wonderful new book, A Perfect Frenzy. Check this out. It is just a wonderful book. Check out Andrew Lawler at Smithsonian Associates. Andrew, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure.
My thanks to Andrew Lawler. Andrew Lawler is a journalist and author who has written about history, science, religion, and politics from dozens of countries. Check out Andrew Lawler's upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation with details in our show notes today. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show, and my thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates 60th Anniversary Interview Series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.